Good afternoon, Assalamu alaikum. I work in a very wide range of areas, but I'm going to be quite focused on what I do in relation to Pakistan. I'm British-born Pakistani, so you can perhaps draw your own conclusions about identity and integration and citizenship by the nature of my work in Pakistan, but given time is limited, I'll focus on Pakistan. I work as a documentary filmmaker and a journalist and a campaigner. I work very closely with Human Rights Commission Pakistan, and I also work very closely with Karachi University, Lahore University, various minority rights organisations, and a Joker theatre company. And I do it very much in the context of being British and being a British Pakistani and having grown up in Manchester, where I spent most of my childhood, and I studied at Sheffield and later at LSE. So I've essentially spent 90% of my life in Britain, but as a child I spent a lot of time in Pakistan during school holidays as a teenager. And what I've been part of doing is I set up a blog called The Samosa, which was a media blog, which was just young journalists and young writers in Pakistan and British Pakistani swapping ideas. A lot of that came after the events of 9/11 and 7/7. I'd been working as a policy advisor in the Mayor of London's office, Ken Livingstone's office. I'd worked as a director of an arts centre. And I've been someone that's very much from the British Pakistani community, but perhaps took a different career trajectory from what many British Pakistanis do. And this project, the Royal Society of Arts and Commerce's Pakistan Calling project, now hosts about 60 films across history, identity, religion, culture, social issues, development issues, economic issues in relation to Pakistan and links with Britain. And I'm going to screen some film clips. We've had some brilliant reviews. We've had feedback that everything you ever wanted to know about Pakistan but didn't know where to go. We've had a lot of very strong peer reviews from particularly journalists that worked in Northern Ireland who see a similarity with the work that happened in Belfast between Catholic and Protestant. We do a lot of work between Sikh, Hindu, Muslim, minority communities, Christian issues, a lot around the Buddhist and Hindu and Indus Valley traditions of what is now Pakistan and was historically a third of India. But it's very much rooted in a positive dynamic and a positive relationship with the British Pakistani community. I'm someone that got quite fed up about what I saw as a very didactic, patronising attitude to the British Pakistani community from many within the British establishment, and I wanted to focus on the positive sides of our community. I myself, as anyone that I researched my background will probably realise, having worked in the music industry for a long time in the arts, I probably don't fit into anyone's definition of a Orthodox Muslim, but I come from a very traditional Orthodox Muslim family and a very traditional Orthodox Muslim community. And I was also very aware of the strengths that that community has around charity and social cohesion and strength, as well as some of the weaknesses we can sometimes have around enforcing values and not allowing independence. But I wanted to do something that worked with the positive elements of the British Pakistani community. And I think sometimes we should remind ourselves of who we are and what we are and where we come from, and not let other people define that for us. And if there's so much hostility to British Muslims and British Pakistanis we have organisations like the Henry Jackson Society, various quite abrasive websites that are always trying to criticise British Muslims. And I think, one, we're a very British Pakistanis, British Muslims, back to numbers, 50% of the British Muslim community is British Pakistani. So many issues around sensitivities around Islam or identity or equality or sectarian issues, British Pakistanis and British Muslims can get conflated into the same issue. The British Pakistani Muslim community is currently estimated to be about 1.4, 1.5 million. That's based on the 2001 census, where 900,000 people identified themselves as British Pakistani. So if you extrapolate from 2001 to 2014 with population growth, it's about 1.5 million. That's approaching 1 in 54, 1 in 55 Brits has got Pakistani heritage. So we're a very, very large community. It's a very multi-layered community. And I think the relationship with Pakistan is quite fascinating as someone that spent a lot of time in Pakistan in recent years, because the vast majority of British Pakistanis tend to come from rural, traditional village backgrounds. It's Mirpur, it's Jhelum, it's Shahiwal, parts of Multan and Bahawalpur, where my own family come from. You know, my parents are Punjabi farmers. You know, I've still got relatives that live in villages that shower with a bucket over their heads. You know, it's that, we come from rural communities, and we should be quite proud of that. You know, I'm very worried about this demonisation of British Pakistanis for that relationship with a rural community. The communities here are different from the American Pakistani community, which is very much Lahore, Karachi, Islamabad, the elites of Pakistani society. And I'm proud of coming from a village background. I realise there's huge issues around cultural equality, gender equality. A lot of those are poverty. A lot of those issues that other South Asian developing countries face. But very quickly, what RSA Pakistan Calling is about is, can you take the relationships that 1.2, 1.5 million British Pakistanis have with Pakistan and use it to help development around education, women's equality, minority rights, environmental issues, and deal with the crises that Pakistan face. And having spent a huge amount of time in Pakistan recently, I think the problems are just as much about poverty and social exclusion and elites and hierarchies as they are about sectarianism and religious violence. The two are a very toxic mix. Pakistan's population is 180 million. It could be 300 million within 2 generations, which is an existential crisis. If you look at the things that hold Pakistan together, the ED Foundation, the Citizens Foundation, the welfare networks, civil society networks, they can't cope with a doubling of population. There's lots of British Pakistanis in Pakistan doing amazing work. You know, Islamic Relief are an extraordinary organisation. You know, we don't hear enough about them, but we hear all the time about the idiots in Al-Mujahideen, and I think we should actually do more as an organisation, as a community, to counter that. And essentially what we've been doing very slowly, but methodically, is we've now built links between Pakistani theatre organisations in Karachi and Lahore, who are working with theatre organisations in the South Bank. We've built links between Bradford College, Bradford University, Karachi University, Lahore University. We're showing a side of Pakistani society that isn't always seen in Pakistan. It's a side that is shrinking, it's under threat from extremism and sectarianism, and we're working to help those elements. So I'm going to very quickly show a few film clips. I'm very wary of an approach that is just based on security. I think that's not always helpful. I think an approach on education, on civil society, on human rights, on transparency, on democracy is actually far more powerful to support democracy than some of the security agendas. I thought the Prevent programmes were awful because they stigmatised many British Muslims. And the other side of what we do, and I say that as someone that is on the front foot of working with Human Rights Commission Pakistan on minority rights, so I'm not saying it from a position of comfort, I'm saying it for someone that's active in the field in Pakistan. The work we do in Pakistan and the work we do in the British Pakistani community is empowered by, we champion organisations. I'm going to show 2 quick films of, this is an organisation that I've been working with very closely in Pakistan. KVTC have now been able to connect with other disability welfare networks in London, which is very powerful because it's very hard. Half the staff at KVTC find it difficult to travel because of visa issues. And stopping organisations getting isolated is something the British Pakistani community is in a very powerful position to do. But also, what's really interesting is very few of the organisations I meet talk about the issues in Pakistan that we talk about. They talk about poverty, about youth isolation, about sectarianism, about tribal issues, but it's not always seen in the religion. The religion's always there. And also the last thing that we're trying to do, I want to keep coming back to this is a British Pakistani project. And one of the things we've faced historically in this country is glass ceilings in politics, in law, in journalism, in media, and slowly those are being broken. And actually one of the last glass ceilings is international development. So if you visit the leadership of the British Council or the Department for International Development or the World Health Organization or UNICEF, you meet very few British Pakistanis working there, because historically talent in our community, conservative professions, law, medicine, engineering, law, science, not politics or journalism. And that's a real issue in Pakistan, where some of the largest development issues of our time are being played out. And as British citizens, as British Pakistanis, with our language skills, our cultural skills, we've got a lot to offer. And what these films are doing is actually showing kids in Bradford and Luton and Manchester that as young British citizens that are bilingual and they've got mixed cultural heritage and incredibly detailed understandings of religion and culture and Islam because of their families and their heritage, as British citizens you've got a lot to offer internationally. So this is a British project, but it's about our links with Pakistan as well. Thank you.
Ask you a question then, because I appreciate the angle in which you are tackling and approaching it, and you're fed up with the negative portrayal of Pakistanis post 9/11, the stigmatization, and obviously these attempts, these videos are attempts to celebrate the positive aspects of Pakistan, which will hopefully then reflect back to the community here.
Yeah.
But don't you think that that's only just kind of scratching the surface, that it's all very well showing the positive aspects, but there is a real need in terms of introspecting, and there should be no harm actually, and it's actually quite helpful for us to actually introspect and actually discuss within the community, not necessarily saying the outside onlookers, but we within the community should actually bring out things from under the carpet and discuss these are issues, stigma, issues that are taboo or there is connected, have stigma attached to them. Do you think it's healthy for a society to become enlightened, to actually tackle all of those issues first, rather than just try and portray a kind of a positive veneer to keep everybody else happy? And because I come across people quite often that they dislike any kind of, even Pakistani people, British Pakistanis are always, why is the British Pakistani talk about Pakistan? You've got no right to talk about Pakistan. I personally feel that if we have the knowledge, we should expose misdoings, misdeeds within our community, and then debate them within our communities. So that was just one question.
It's about 5 questions.
Well, my view about,
I think,
discuss the negative.
I think, look, I think anyone that looks at the work the Samosa does and the work that RSA Pakistan Calling does would come to a very fair conclusion that we meet all the difficult subjects head on. The Samosa was the first blog to pick up issues around rape in marriage and some horrendous comments by supposedly religious scholars about rape in marriage being acceptable. We broke that story.
And then I responded to that, didn't I?
Yeah. So, we do probably, I do personally, I'm very heavily involved in issues around rights with the Ahmadi community, which have led to me receiving flack from within my own family. So I come from a Sufi Barelvi family, but you just don't back down on issues of equality, on human rights, and gender equality, okay? We've been very involved in the issues in Birmingham and the debates around schools, and I think that represents a real test for communities in this country, because you've had 2 issues get conflated that are very difficult. The first is the absolute right to ensure gender equality in schools and not have segregation, whether it's swimming or whether it's physical education or access to the arts or access to an equal education. But also alongside that, we have communities that are religiously quite conservatively orthodox. And to conflate that with a connection to terrorism, as people like Michael Gove and organisations like Quillam have done, is, I think, thoroughly pernicious. You can be religiously orthodox, religiously conservative, and not somehow be an enemy within or a traitor. You know, there is a religiously conservative orthodox part to our communities, and I don't think we should demonise that. And what we do by working with health and development and education organisations is actually engage the religiously orthodox in society building, which is far, far more positive than alienating them. And as someone whose background's a DJ and a club promoter, you know, I'm not someone that is in any way sympathetic to religious prejudice or religious sectarianism or religious bigotry, but I respect religiously orthodox communities and their place in history and culture and heritage, and it's a very difficult thing. You know, no one says to the Jewish community that you've got elements within your religious orthodoxy that have got quite unpleasant views, whilst those views exist, because there's an understanding about the complexity of religious orthodoxy and scripture and how scriptures can be interpreted. And I think we need to be allowed as a Muslim community to work that out away from a superiority agenda. So that's what I have a problem with as a human rights activist and a pacifist and someone that believes in absolute human equality.
So you don't think, sorry to just carry this on, but don't you think the call of the hour is that, you know, the Pakistani community is undergoing a crisis at the moment, and the call of the hour is to kind of, you know, tackle it head on and maybe wake people up and say that, you know, even if they are ultra-orthodox, ultra-conservative, maybe they are prone to then being attracted towards the extremist elements. Is there not a thing?
Yay and nay. I mean, I came across his book Tahir when I was 16, and I was probably that demographic of a young, working class, northern British Pakistani, angry about racism, angry about... It took me 30 seconds to work out that his book Tahir were a bunch of fascist, unpleasant morons that I didn't want anything to do with. So I trust the integrity of young British male Pakistanis to work things out for themselves, and I'm very worried about this idea that somehow we're a community that isn't capable of confronting sectarianism. Not everyone that comes from Belfast, whether they're loyalist or Protestant, is associated with the IRA or the UVF. Not everyone that watches those parades is a terrorist sympathiser. So I think there's shades and nuance here, and I am very worried about how there is a bash the Muslims, bash the Pakistanis lobby, and Douglas Murray's a great example of it, you know, who's on record as saying he wants to make life for Muslims in Europe harder across the board. So I think, you know, my instincts are to stand against that, as well as stand for absolute equality in Pakistan and issues in this community. I think we have major issues around gender equality that need to be engaged with. I think we need to meet head on those challenges.
How do we deal with them? You know, you've identified that there are issues. How are we going to deal with them without actually, you know, ruffling anybody's feathers?
It's a really... The problem, in my view, is segregated schooling. It's not a simple issue to resolve. The school I went to, Burnage High School in Manchester, it's a great school, but it's far more... When I went, it was about a third British Pakistani. Now I think it's much, much higher. So it's segregated schooling. Segregated schooling is a mixed bag because it's come out of demographic change and white flight to the suburbs. Immigrant communities since time immemorial have always clustered together, from Italian Americans and Italian Jews in Brooklyn to what we have in Southall or Bradford. So segregated schooling is a huge problem. Within segregated schooling, you've got this increased sort of, I don't even want to use the word Wahhabi or Salafist, because there's Wahhabi and Salafist people in my family, and I profoundly disagree with their interpretations on scripture and their interpretations on gender and minorities, but they're part of my family, I'm not going to deny that. I think we've got we're completely as a country confused. On the one hand, we take billions from Saudi Arabia in arms and trades and commercial deals, but we turn a blind eye to them then sponsoring mosques that teach segregation. So is it the working class kid going to a mosque, or is it our relationship with Saudi Arabia? Pinning all this on the British Pakistani community, I think, is profoundly unfair.
Can I just quickly come in on that? So socially conservative attitudes become a problem only when they are imposed on others who don't share that worldview. And I've got a prime example of how we were able to challenge this. Universities UK put out some guidance on gender segregation in universities towards the end of last year, and said that it was acceptable for an external speaker coming into a university to dictate the seating arrangements, to say that men and women have to sit on different sides of the room. And a group of us, both Muslim, non-Muslim, secular activists, all got together. We protested outside the University's UK building. We put out lots of blogs to say why this was such a flawed decision. A number of us, several people wrote to the Equality and Human Rights Commission, which is the main sort of non-departmental public body that deals with equality and human rights issues. And after sustained public pressure, Universities UK withdrew this guidance, and they are currently, and very recently they put out redrafted guidance with the help of the Equality and Human Rights Commission, who put out guidelines on what should and shouldn't happen. And the Equality and Human Rights Commission came back to say that you shouldn't allow external speakers to be able to dictate to universities how that men and women can sit separately. So that was a real victory for us.
Thank you very much. Listened to you a few times before the meeting. I can't disagree with what you have done so far. And I think when the word secular is used, it seems like once you use the word secular in the same sentence as Muslim, it seems like that you're negating one or the other. So I think that's good to see that you can have a faith in whatever and still be embracing and be able to move on. I mean, whatever is in the scriptural text is one thing, like Jewish or orthodoxy or whatever. Let it remain there, but we move forward in a more positive. Does that make sense? Kind of thing? But the problem is that secular and Muslim it's difficult two words to go together in some ways, and people don't see one, because Muslim is just one thing and doesn't allow any secularist kind of...
Well, I think I raised the example of someone like Manwa Ali, who was still very religious, very, very devout, but his views have changed to the point where he does support secular democracy, and he actually says that it's enabled him to be a better religious leader, because he has full religious freedom, and he's able to educate other people about his religion without imposing on them.
I think what is lacking generally among us is we tend to kind of challenge stereotypes either within or in the mainstream. We need to do both, and we need to do both with equal regard. And the other thing where we, I think, fail, we tend to make wrong comparisons. For example, you start comparing things here with Pakistan, but that's not like-for-like comparison. So you have to be very, very careful. You have to apply rationality to any comparisons. Yeah. And generally speaking, what is lacking in most rational discussion is the tools you use. Sometimes serious discussion, and it's a very effective tool, don't get me wrong. On the other hand, you need poetry, you need art, you need cultural fusion, you need humor as well, which we lack very desperately in the moment.
Yeah, can I?
And I just wanted to also add that I went to a conference a couple of years ago, and one kind of comparison was raised was it's quite a high-profile publisher who said to me, I see the Indian community celebrate their culture, their diversity, the colourful. And he said, I've been to Pakistan. He said, why don't you do it here in this country? So I'm just wondering what your thoughts are about that. Why isn't our community in Britain celebrating its culture, its colour?
I think that, this is where oh goodness, there is an element of neurosis in some of the issues around the identity of Pakistan, because, and the relationship with India. Okay, so if you look at it, Now, India is named after the river Indus, the land of the Indus. 90% of the Indus is in Pakistan. So that relationship between Pakistan and India is traumatic, it's fragile, the horrendous actions around partition on both sides where, you know, I come from a family that were expelled from Amritsar and Jalandhar, you know, and, you know, Lahore expelled the vast majority of its Sikh and Hindu population. So there's an urgent need for conflict resolution between between Pakistan and India. And that plays out in identity issues that, you know, I don't want to go into too much detail about it, but, you know, there's actually, Pakistan's actually very, very similar to Israel in some ways in terms of its history, its background, its nature. And you could have a narrative, a country that's done a lot of wrong, but also a country that has been wronged, you know, so that needs some more kind of, I mean, the obvious example is Pakistan's full of people that were expelled from India that have suffered from religious violence, were expelled from their homelands, but Pakistan also expelled large amounts of its Hindu and Sikh community. So it's a country that has been a victim, but has also created victims. And I think if you bring it fast forward to today, the relationship between the British Hindu community, the British Indian community, hasn't been affected by conflict that's happening around Muslim communities vis-à-vis Iraq or Gaza or Palestine. There's not been, you know, a very good Indian friend of mine said, you know, the British haven't bombed any Hindu or Sikh villages or cities for quite a long time now, but, you know, conflict in Muslim communities is ongoing, and that gets played out today. And I just think the issue around religion and state, Europe had huge issues around separation of church and state and political power, and those issues are getting played out in South Asia now. A lot of this is sheer naked power grabs by certain Arab dictators. You know, some of the conflicts are driven by empire and power, not dissimilar to what was happening between Elizabeth I and the Vatican and Spain. You know, and so, you know, where you sit as a working class British Pakistani kid in Bradford is sometimes quite difficult in that context.
I wanted to ask Anwar about the filmmaking projects. We have faith minorities in Pakistan as well, Pakistani Christians, Pakistani Hindus, Pakistani Sikhs. Have you done any work with those communities? Because where I live and work recently, some Pakistani Christian families have arrived in that region, and a lot of my colleagues were quite surprised to find out that Pakistan had Christian communities as well, and they weren't too sure how to support those families. So I just wanted to ask you if you've done any work with those communities as well. Because it would benefit the British communities as well as the minorities in Pakistan.
What's happening to the minorities of Pakistan's heartbreaking. You know, as someone that's been born in Britain and grew up as part of the anti-racist movement and Rock Against Racism and the Anti-Nazi League, the principle of minority rights goes to the heart of decency in a state. How a state treats its minorities is the fundamental benchmark, in my view, of the decency of that state. And we've actually had quite a bit of conversation in the RSA, because the RSA were adamant that they weren't going to support just the minority rights, human rights work of Pakistan that the Samosa does. They had to be built into something broader around social change and human development. And I also knew that if you want to bring the British Pakistani community with you, and the vast majority of the British Pakistani community are Muslim from a Sunni and Shia background, you've got to broaden it to social development and health and education. Because if you just work around minority rights, it's a tragedy to say it, but people will assume it's a security agenda to bash Pakistan. I find that really upsetting, but you know, that is the reality of what you will face. And so, as a group of people that were very driven by minority rights, we decided that the most effective thing was to broaden it. And I think we have done a lot to raise awareness, particularly amongst Orthodox communities. You know, I've had conversations with very Orthodox communities, I've gone into madrasas, and the reason I'm welcome is because we're working with Karachi University, we're working with Islamic Relief. So they will listen to what we say about the savagery of what's happening to the Ahmadi community. It's just disgusting what's being done there. It's reminiscent of the Weimar and Nazi Germany, and it needs saying, and we do say it. But I'm also aware that if you're saying it as part of a wider set of programs to help societal change, you're probably going to be listened to more. So yeah, minority rights is at the heart of it, and I would just ask for, if you haven't watched the films, watch the films, share them, send them to Islamic societies. A lot of what we do is engaging Islamic societies and getting them to engage with us. So yes.
Just one thing, extending what you said, the role of minorities actually in the constitution of Pakistan actually is very shameful. I think whatever happens in a common man's mindset is different, but the theocratization of constitution is actually stigmatize the minorities even more, because there was kind of, say, 10% minority when Pakistan was, now they're kind of diminishing. Maybe the green part of the flag is actually growing and the white part is, so I think that is also in the constitution, in your workplace, the treatment of Christians, no matter what we call them, it's so shameful.
And you can directly trace its historical roots, partly the ordinance and the laws against Ahmadis were passed directly related to House of Saud sponsorship of the nuclear program. So, there's those set of issues about the relationships. Pakistan cannot be a democracy whilst its constitution says that the president must be a Muslim. That's disgusting. What does that say to, what does that say to a minor, how would we feel if a constitution of Britain said a Muslim can't be a prime minister? And that double standard needs to be confronted all the time. And the treatment of minorities in Pakistan is heartbreaking. I'm duty bound to say something that the students at Karachi University will say, which is they say that, it's terrible what's happening to the minorities, but it's terrible what's happening to everyone else. If you're working class, your issues are limited. And there is a little bit of, everyone's interested in minorities, but it's just tough being working class. It's tough being a girl. Yeah, unless you're from a feudal or an elite or a connected family. And partly what we try and do is break down some of those kind of social divides, but it's very difficult in Pakistan. But one thing I would say is, as British Pakistanis, my loyalty is to Britain, but I share a heritage with Pakistan and I want to help. Now that's an individual decision. There might be other British Pakistanis that couldn't care less. But I feel very privileged that I'm in a position where I can try and do something.
I think it will have to come within any change. Will have to come within our own. That will be the first. Nobody else is going to come and say, we have a stake here. My kids are doing that. We have a huge stake here. We can't afford to just let it go and close our eyes.
Absolutely.
Thank you.